Evening, everybody, to Luxem, the Zurich PMT Center, where we have many nationalities coming and going. We are on site in the Tara Lounge with our director and co-director and other nice helpers. And then regulars and newcomers to Luxem and me as the SPC, who is actually quite happy that I was able to persuade Scott Snibbe to give us these teachings on what we could officially call also tenets, but the 4 views on reality. And it's also based upon the fact that I'm doing the basic program at Jamyang London, where we absolutely, whatever we do is talking about those 4 views on reality, doing the engaging in the Bodhisattva's path these days. And if I didn't understand those schools, I would hardly be able to navigate in those advanced teachings. And we have people doing that course as well here tonight. But obviously, it's Scott who will guide us in the second installment of the views. And I'm very happy to give the word to you, Scott, in a second when I'm gone. Here we are.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's so nice to see everybody. And I think there's slightly more people here than last time too, which is always a good sign with the class. Usually it gets a little smaller as time goes on. So it's always a good sign if it grows bigger. Let's start with just a tiny bit of meditation. I like to start classes just with a 1-minute meditation because it has such a big effect on your mind and your attitude. So get into your meditation posture and establish motivation. One motivation I like to remind myself often is that there's nothing better we could be doing with our time right now. It's, at least for me, I can't always say that. I don't always feel that way. So as soon as I got invited to start teaching meditation, that's what I felt during that hour or 2 when I was teaching. Definitely nothing better I could be doing with my time. And similarly with meditating, studying the Dharma. So we can feel good about that. It's not easy. There's many other things competing for our attention and people to take care of. So meditating to bring out our best qualities and to be of benefit to everyone in our lives and that we encounter. And then just for 1 minute, let's focus on the breath to stabilize the mind. And then you can come out of that meditation. So there's some people who weren't here last time, right? So I could, is that right? A couple, yeah. So this class, just as a reminder, the class, it isn't the full detail academic version of tenets, which someone tried to invite me to teach, and I declined, and I don't think I would ever be able to teach that class. But with this class is experiential tenets, which was introduced to me by my teacher, Venerable Rene Fusi, who I think some of you know. He's Swiss. He's my closest teacher. And he taught this class first with Emily Sue, another great teacher who went through the master's program. And I was really moved by it the first time I studied. I did a retreat. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. But I was really moved by that approach because I studied tenets a few times and very confused at first, so especially trying to decide what was, because I was studying with Geshe Darpa and I was confused. I would think, what is definitive? There were things that contradicted each other. It was very early in my Buddhist journey that this topic came up. So this version of the class, I think, makes it, it simplifies it, makes it experiential, and really just distills out a few points of, the four main schools. We don't talk about the sub schools as much. We went through the Vaibhashika school last time, which I like to call the atomist school. I've tried to call the schools by names that make sense in English. English words that remind you of the core positions of the schools. And then the other thing, for anyone who wasn't here last time, I like to mention is just that from my teachers, it was just reiterated a couple of weeks ago by another Geshe I'm studying with, that he said the schools you don't want to see the schools as wrong and right, and the last one is the most correct, but more that each school is appropriate for different people, different minds at different times. And that's what I found as I studied the topic more and practiced it more, that there's huge merits to each perspective, and in some ways unique merits for each of the four major schools that are worth thinking about. And the other thing also is that to really look at yourself and see which school you are at the moment. That it's easy to say, oh, I'm a prasangika, I'm a yamaka practitioner, middle way practitioner, but to actually look at your mind and see what you really believe, like what's at your core, what do you think about reality? And for a lot of people raised in the West, the first school makes a ton of sense because it breaks things down into atoms and moments of consciousness that make sense according to what we understand about physics and neuroscience up to a certain point. And the school next time, I think, actually probably makes the most sense according to quantum physics. So for anyone, don't miss the next class. The third class is kind of my favorite. Sorry to pick favorites, but I think the third class has some of the most unique material in it and talks about how the Yogacara, mind-only school, may be the most coherent with modern quantum physics interpretation of reality. So today we're on the Sutantrika or Sutra school. This is kind of the mellowest class. There's a little bit less material, so we can do it more slowly, which is nice. And in preparing for the class, this was the hardest thing I did. And again, for anyone who missed the last time, preparing for this class was the hardest thing I did. And I kind of questioned whether I should attempt to teach a class like this. But my teachers encouraged me, and I got some amazing materials to prepare for this class that aren't published, like George Dreyfus's notes on tenets, which are very valuable, and my teacher Venerable Renee's notes, and Venerable Sangye Kadjo. So I was really, really, really happy to get so many good materials and such good teachers I could ask clarifying questions. So I hope it's a benefit. All right, so today we're going to do an introduction to this Sutantrika or Sutra school, and then two different meditations. And in general, that's what we do in most of the classes. All right, so let's get started with that. So the Sutantrika school. Oh, the last thing I want to mention for people that didn't know is, I've become more and more, as I study this topic, I become really in awe of, Vasubandhu, who there's a lot to say about, but he was a 4th century Buddhist genius adept, and he went through like 3 of the schools in his own lifetime and through his own evolution. And so if someone that brilliant and wise and realized went through those schools, I think it shows the benefit for us to take them very seriously. Okay, so the Satantrika or the Sutra school, which doesn't necessarily clarify things that well for us in referring to it as a Sutra school, but it's the second of the 4 schools of reality, and it's the one that always confused me the most. But in preparing for this class, for the first time, I think I came to understand the distinctions and the merits of this view a little better. I always had a sort of vague and wavy sense of this school until I was forced to study it more closely for this class. So here, I'll try to present it very simply. In the Sutra school, the outer world is still real, and there's no selflessness of phenomena. But we will do a meditation on phenomena from the Sutra school, because the view is both different and interesting compared to the atomist or the Vaibhashika point of view, and I'll explain why. Because in the Sutra school, and I think this is the key point, in the Sutra school, it reverses the idea of ultimate truth being the indivisible parts of reality, right? So that was what in the last atomist school, that's what I like to call it, the atomist by Vaibhashika, is that you find ultimate reality in the indivisible parts of reality, in atoms, like partless particles we talk about. So instead of finding ultimate truth in the indivisible parts of reality, it says that the ultimate truth is that which performs a function. So it's the compounded phenomena that are ultimate truths in this school, and not the little parts that you break them down to. Right? That's not that hard to understand that, right? When you distill it down to its essence. So in this school, all impermanent phenomena are ultimate truths. And so for this reason, I think a good common sense name for this school is functionalists, because we say ultimate reality is found in things that come together by performing a function. So that's the name I like to use for this school, functionalists. So then on top, and that's pretty clear, right? That's we're not in the word scramble salad that we sometimes get with the tenets. It's not that hard to understand. So then on top of this idea of ultimate truth being that which performs a function, we add on for the first time the mind. So in the prior school, the atomist school, we weren't talking about minds. But in this school, we add on for the first time the mind, that the mind imputes the concept of table onto its parts. It's like the most common example we hear in Buddhist classes. We still accept partless particles, atoms or subatomic particles. And just as a side note, I think you don't want to go too far. You don't want to cross the barrier to quantum physics. I talked about this last time when you talk about atomists or partless particles, it's more of the view of reality up through Einstein. That once you get to quantum physics, the idea of partless particles evaporates because you have more probabilistic reality. So when you talk about atoms, it's more the way we thought of atoms right up until quantum theory. The idea that reality can be subdivided only up until a point, and then you find these partless particles that make everything up. So we still accept partless particles, atoms or subatomic particles, and we still accept that the mind is made of indivisible moments of awareness. And they use this amount of time they call the duration of a finger snap, which I'm not sure how. I have heard some teachers try to measure that to something like, 20th of a second or something like that. I'm not sure. So in this school, there is the table out there, and the base of labeling exists from its own side on the partless particles and how they're built up. The trees are out there, but the mind imputes forest, and the car is imputed on the basis of the car parts. So that's the way phenomena are treated in this functionalist school. You talk about the mind, you talk about parts coming together, and the performing of the function as those parts come together is the ultimate reality. So that's a quick explanation of the school. And that's also the meditation. That's the first meditation we're going to do, is to see reality from that perspective. In this class, I spend much less time on explaining and much more time on meditating. So the introduction is quite short, and then we'll go into the meditation. So the second thing we're doing, so that's we're going to look at the reality of phenomena from the functionalist school, to a meditation on that. And then the next thing we're going to do is a meditation on subtle selflessness. And subtle selflessness is the same in the first three major schools, in the atomist, the sutra or functionalist schools, and the Chittamatra school or mind school. It's called mind school. So I decided to do it here in the second class, since there's time for it. before we get to the more subtle school. So subtle selflessness. So what is the person in this functionalist school? And spoiler alert, you can find the person in this school, and we find her in the mental consciousness. So just one of the 5 aggregates, and not the collection. So as you go through the 5 aggregates in meditation, it's good to ask yourself, openly. Normally you ask yourself with real kind of open curiosity, which one do I find myself in? And in this one, there's a conclusion that you do find yourself in the mental consciousness, which a lot of people do naturally. Sometimes, remember Renee taught me to lead the 5 aggregates meditation in this very open way, where you lead the 5 aggregates meditation, and then you ask people, what did you identify with most? Did I feel more like my feeling, perception, the other mental factors, my body, or consciousness? And I've always been one of those people that kind of found myself in consciousness. So it was nice to see that actually is a specific school where you do find yourself in your awareness. And I would bet a lot of people on this call actually tend to identify with that too as you do that meditation. We spend so much time in the mind as Tibetan Buddhists. I think it's quite easy to feel much more identified with that than other aspects of ourself. So what we meditate on to try and refute is the idea of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. That's the famous phrase. So a person that's separate from the aggregates. That's the easier way to say it. It's a person separate from the parts that make them up. And when you hear that, like, refuting the person separate from the parts that make them up, it sounds like a no-brainer, right? Like for those of us who are raised with a scientific view, the idea of a person who's separate from the body and mind as we understand them seems quite silly and obviously untrue. So here's where it's worth just analyzing yourself a little bit, and also our language. Like, still in our language, we say my body, we say my mind, my thoughts, my feelings. So I think if you really examine what you actually think about yourself, and not just, nod your head, nod our heads and say, of course, I'm not separate from my body and mind. It's a much deeper and profound meditation, because, our language, and I think in many ways an ordinary way of thinking, even if we're like hardcore scientific materialists, we are holding into this idea of a self that's separate from the body. And, say, even scientists will say my body, and neuroscientists will say my body and my mind. Well, what's the my? Who's the my that owns those two things? So I think this is a very deep and profound meditation that can help cut the root of feeling separate, and that separateness then comes with feelings of feeling superior or inferior, and all the other delusions that arise from those thoughts of being separate. Because at first you feel it's the root of it is feeling separate from your aggregates, right? And that starts to make you feel separate from everything else. So yeah, because even though science says that we aren't more than, even both science, and the highest middle way view says that we aren't more than the sum of our parts. The way that we talk and think and intuit about ourselves might actually say, yes, I feel that there's something separate from my body and mind that owns and controls them. So in the evolution of Buddhist ideas, these Sutantrikas or functionalists speak for the first time of nominal existence. And other terms for this are imputed, assigned, ascribed by conscious conceptions. And this is an extremely important point because it's one of the fundamental concepts that we meet in the subtlest middle way school, where we later decide that phenomena exist only as merely labeled or mere imputations, without any findable, indivisible base of matter or mind. But in this school we explore today, it doesn't go quite that far. Where we explore today in the school, functional school, is being labeled is part of other aspects of true findable reality. including partless particles and indivisible moments of consciousness. So you see that idea of being labeled can coexist with other schools. The sort of merely labeled, the merely is very, very important in the middle way school, because in other ones things can be labeled, and that you can also have indivisible parts of matter and consciousness. So that's an introduction. When you do it that way, it's not that tricky to understand, I think. And now we're going to move into the meditation. So the meditation on sutra phenomena first, and then on subtle selflessness. And just a reminder, the meditation on sutra phenomena is unique to this second school, the functionalist school. And the meditation on subtle selflessness that we do is common to the first three schools, to the atomist, the functionalist or sutra school, and the Citamatra school. Okay, so let's go into that meditation. Okay, so find yourself in meditation, and then we'll take a little break after this too, and then we'll go on to the second meditation and have time for discussion. Okay, so get back into your posture. Straighten your spine, relax your shoulders, all the muscles in your face, your neck. Try to feel a real sense of ease, if that's possible. And then for refuge, I think most people on the call are Buddhists, so we can do a more Buddhist refuge. But in this case, it might be nice to think of the lineage, like Asanga, Vasubandhu, Nagarjuna, Namasankapa. It's really extraordinary that the lineage has been preserved so purely and accurately, and so many commentaries exist, and we are learning from teachers that are lineage holders that preserve a lineage that's almost 2,000 years old. I think for refuge, it might be nice just to feel that sense of awe and a sense of connection to the extraordinary minds that developed and upheld and debated these lineages since the 4th century. And then again, we could have motivation, maybe more specific motivation to understand these schools in a practical way that helps us understand reality better and to steer our own inner reality and our behavior towards a happy, meaningful, beneficial life. And if we believe it's possible, toward the ideal of enlightenment. And then also, once again, 1 minute on the breath to stabilize our mind. A nice trick to remember with focusing on the breath, which for most people is sometimes the very most difficult meditation, is that if your mind strays away, which it almost certainly will, just whatever you're distracted by, just let it fade away, sensations, thoughts, and just steer your mind gently back to your breath without pulling close the distractions and without pushing them away. So 1 minute to focus on the breath. So with that stabler mind, like we did in the last class now, conjure an object in your mind that you want to examine more closely in meditation. The ones that we were looking at before were a car, your home, or my favorite object, your phone. If you really want to use one of the classic Buddhist examples, like a table or cup, that's fine too, but I like these complex modern objects. So choose your object. And then for a minute, break down its parts, like we did last time, going from gross parts to subcomponents, to molecules, elements, atoms, subatomic particles. And in this view, we still believe reality stops there at indivisible subatomic particles. So do that for a couple minutes on your own. Try to, really helps to go in detail, like with the phone, from its case and glass to its microchips and wires, and then to the materials, copper and gold and aluminum. In fact, 75 elements, almost all the elements in the universe in your phone, and subatomic particles. And stop there. Stop there. The idea that you find the object at its indivisible subatomic parts. So just on your own for a couple minutes. So as we rest on these subatomic particles, partless particles, in this view, we find that these subatomic particles are not ultimate truth. but rather ultimate truth is how they come together to perform a function. So we start to analyze cause and effect. First, we can think about the immediate causes. With your phone, imagine the people that designed it, the people that manufactured all the subcomponents, the people who transported these components by air, ship, truck, or on foot between dozens of different countries. Think how many people's fingerprints are on your phone. How many people touched all those different parts over the course of its manufacture. It's the same with the parts of your home, the place where you're sitting right now, many of us. Imagine where all the raw materials were made surrounding you and how they came to be in your home. Who designed or grew or melted, cut, brought them to the place where they are now. Imagine that gross chain of cause and effect with the parts of your home. And then similarly with food, think of the last meal you ate. Bring to mind the people who planted the crops, who watered and fertilized them, who processed or cooked the foods and who sold them to you, how they ended up in your home and eventually your belly. Then we move on to deeper causes. Think further back to the evolution of science and technology, agriculture, and commerce. I recently learned that the cultivation of most of the vegetables and plants, grains that we eat, they were almost inedible originally, almost unrecognizable compared to what we have today with corn and wheat and apples and so on. That it took 3,000 to 4,000 years of people just very, very gradually selecting the slightly tastier versions and planting the seeds from those. For many of the people, they wouldn't have seen any difference in their lifetime time. So it's such a small difference, but it's happened independently in societies around the world. We owe an enormous debt to those people who worked for 3,000 to 4,000 years to cultivate the plants that are the basis of our food system. That's just one example. You can even think back to the dawn of society itself that made the cultivation and collection of these raw materials possible. Go back further, think back to the evolution of intelligent life on Earth that led to human beings being able to work together like this. Millions of years of hominid evolution and before. Go back even to the dawn of life on Earth 4 billion years ago. Back to the birth of our star, our solar system, about 4.5 billion years ago. Back further to the explosion of earlier stars that led to the fusion of the heavy elements like carbon and oxygen that form most of the elements of life on Earth. As your hands overlap or touch each other or touch your knees, the atoms inside them come from stars that exploded before ours was born. And think back even to the start of the universe. Where the simpler elements like hydrogen and helium formed. See how the object before you is connected to the entire history of the universe? And see how it's still connected at this instant. How each particle in your object feels the gravitational pull of every other particle in the universe. And also interacts electrochemically with others nearby. So it's quite an awe-inspiring view of reality, despite calling it a lower school. And this is the ultimate truth in this system. Impermanent phenomena coming together to perform a function. But we also introduce another aspect to reality in this functionless school. The role that the mind plays in external reality. An external reality that still really exists. So we now consider the role our minds play in reality. collection of parts in your object, countless trillions of particles, and their grouping into molecules, cells, and human-made structures. Think about all the causes that brought them together. And then see how your mind imposes onto the continuity of parts and the causes that brought them here the label of phone or home or meal. And try and see this label and your mind applying that label as a participant in the existence of your object. So that mind is also seen to be real. It's broken down into a stream of indivisible moments of consciousness, atomic moments of conscious awareness. Your mind is an equal participant with a real external reality made up of composite phenomena put together from partless particles, atoms. Now, when we do this, we can also see that other people and other types of minds might not see our object the same way that we do. They may not feel as strongly about your object as you do. They might not care about it at all. They may not even see it as a separate, distinct object. When you realize that other people label and see things differently than you, it can help a little bit to curb our distress. Our perspective is just one of many, arising from parts, causes, and conditions, and the label we impose on them. So this meditation isn't an intellectual exercise. It's meant to soften and eventually eliminate the craving and anger and fear that we feel toward the parade of external objects that comes before us. We don't just meditate because it's interesting. Though it is interesting. So in this view, the mind is a constant stream of indivisible moments of awareness. Try and see it that way. Objects really exist outside us, according to this view, and they're made of indivisible partless particles. Quite a reassuring, grounding view, I think, to many people. A view that many scientists held for a long time. Phenomena exist in dependence upon causes and conditions, and being able to produce effect. And compounded, impermanent phenomena are ultimate truth, ruled by the mind on top of their parts, changing, with causes and conditions that bring them together and dissolve them apart. And you can come out of that meditation, I think. Maybe you have a sense like I do that I can't believe this is actually more understandable with a little bit simpler language. You know, without some of the like jargon and philosophical language, it's not that hard to more clearly understand this school. Functionalist school, if you want to call it that. Ultimate reality is that objects perform functions, and it's grounded in partless particles and individual moments of consciousness. You know, seeing cause and effect, and for the first time, the mind labeling those findable partless particles and moments of consciousness as whatever you see it, you subjectively see it, label it. I think we'll save questions for the end, but we can take a little break and then do the next. It's nice to try to stay in a meditative state. So we're going to do a meditation on subtle selflessness, the one that's shared between the let's call atomist functionalist and mind only schools. But yeah, why don't we take a 5-minute break? Is that good for everybody? Yeah. Let's do that. I'll just come back in 5 minutes. Okay. Back. You guys can hear me? Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. I'll try to stay in this kind of subtle sense of how things exist. So the next meditation is on the subtle selflessness for the first 3 schools, Vaibhashika, or the atomist school, the sutra or functionalist school. And it's also common to the Chittamacha or mind-only school. So we're going to meditate. Get back to your meditation posture, first of all. Maybe just ground yourself with a couple of breaths. So now we meditate on the soul selflessness for the first three schools. It's the same meditation for all of them. Though in this meditation, we take the specific view of the mind that only the sutra or functionalist school has, which is that the mind can be found in the mental consciousness. So meditation's the same, but the conclusion is slightly different for the different schools. It's a functionalist school specific meditation. What you do in this meditation is contemplate the five aggregates of body and mind. And in this first step, you see if you conceive of a self that's separate from them. First, look at your body, its grosser parts, arms, your legs, we're asking ourselves whether we find ourselves in these parts of the body. Our head, do we find ourselves in our body's organs or systems? Brain, liver, kidneys, heart. Do we find ourselves in our blood, our hormones? Sometimes talk quite strongly about our hormones controlling us, so maybe we find ourselves there. Do we find ourselves in our cells? The individual cell is so complex, a little living system of its own. Is that where we find ourselves? Then look further to your body's molecules, your body's atoms, your body's subatomic particle. And in this school, we stop and we find these subatomic particles as the valid basis of material reality. To think now whether you are this body that resolves, is findable in its fundamental parts, indivisible. Ask yourself the question openly. Then steer your mind onto itself. And we move to what we call feeling or sensation, the reaction of pleasure or neutrality, numbness to all experiences. So examine this part of yourself and ask whether I am my feeling aggregate, how I respond to sensations with positive, negative, or neutral. It's quite a dominant force in our mind, so look at it openly, even as it's still working right now, generating feelings towards the words I'm saying, where you're sitting, your feelings about this class. See if you find yourself in the aggregate of feeling. Then steer your mind to perception, the mind's ability to draw a boundary around a collection of really existent parts of the body or mind and label them as an object or concept. Can I find myself here? Is this me, my ability to perceive and label objects? And move your mind to the aggregate of volition or urge, will, drive, motivation, and many other mental experiences that impel us to action. Those mental formations. Am I this aspect of my mind? All those other mental factors dominated by an urge to action. from outside yourself, many people would see you mostly from this perspective of your actions and words. Then move your mind to awareness itself, consciousness. Just experience consciousness intuitively. How do you perceive your consciousness, awareness, as a space, as a continuum, clear, knowing? Try to first find an intuitive sense of what consciousness, awareness, this is. The mind apart from the more active mental factors. See if you can observe your consciousness as a chain of conscious moments. And for this meditation, try to understand consciousness as coming in small, indivisible moments of awareness, each the duration of a finger snap. You reach a point in analyzing consciousness where you find an atomic duration of awareness that can't be separated further. And then ask yourself, do I find myself here in the stream of conscious moments or in any one of them? Is this me? Let these questions linger. And now recall how you refer to yourself as my body, my mind, my thoughts, my feelings, my perception, and so on. All these ways of thinking imply a self that's separate from the five aggregates of body and mind. From this view, like our everyday scientific view, parts of the aggregates really exist. They depend on causes and conditions, and they produce effects. But on top of these parts, is there something else? Something that's not the collection of parts, not any individual part, but some external entity that owns and controls them. yourself reject this out of hand because you think you know the answer. But look at how your mind really functions. Do you feel like you're a kind of controller who owns and steers your body and mind? So in this meditation, as we take on the view of the school, we try to refute the idea that there's a separate I, but only after we do what we're doing right now of genuinely probing ourselves to see that, yes, maybe I do see reality that way. I do feel a separate sense of self, even though I should know better, even according to scientific view. And it's a good idea to probe like this to refute that incorrect view of a self that's separate from the body and mental aggregate. It's honest and humbling to think this way. So having maybe seen that, we do hold to the separate sense of self. Now we return our attention to the mental consciousness aggregate. So here, made up of indivisible moments of consciousness, do I find myself in this aggregate? So in this school, the answer is yes. Take that on as a proposition. I am my awareness. I find myself in the constant stream of indivisible moments of consciousness. Do you agree with that? The stream is impermanent and changing, but I'm findable in individual moments of consciousness. That's what I really am, my consciousness aggregate. So in this school, yes, the person exists. And for the sutra or functionalist, it exists as ultimate reality, existing in dependence upon causes and conditions and being able to produce effect. person does exist in dependence upon causes and conditions and is capable of producing effect because the person is impermanent. I find myself on the stream of my mental consciousness, and I refute a self that's separate from my aggregates. In this school, I exist as ultimate reality, the coming together of indivisible moments of consciousness and indivisible subatomic particles, constantly changing, produced by causes and producing effects. And then to make sure we don't stray into a merely academic meditation, we remember why we're meditating. We meditate on the nature of reality like this, not just because it's interesting or awe-inspiring, but because doing so softens our mind. It awakens us to our interdependent role in the universe and gives us a sense of responsibility, seeing how our every action and even our every thought has new effects on the world. And wanting to make the world a better place through carefully attending to our every word and deed. As you go through the week, see if you can look at reality from this functionalist school and see how it softens your mind, curbs a sense of an independent, unchanging, controlling self toward one that's interdependent and changing in this specific way. And then you can come out of the meditation. So we have plenty of time for questions in this one. Like I said, this is kind of the mellowest class for some reason. A lot in the first, a lot in the other three. And this one's a little, sort of a little more calm. And very beneficial, right? This view, I think, if everybody was seeing reality through this view, I think we'd have a very good world. People's behavior and responsibility would be quite strong with this perspective. Okay, yeah, so any questions, comments? You can unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yeah, Roland?
So you said on the ultimate truth is basically the function of the parts plus the participation of the mind. So my question is, does phenomena also exist outside of your participation on ultimate level? Or like on ultimate level not, but would you think in this school that phenomena exist outside of your participation?
Yeah, so my understanding, from the school is that it's the interaction. This is the first school where you bring the mind into the participation. So things don't, the partless particles, I think, do exist, right? The partless particles do exist without the mind, according to this school. And the individual moments of consciousness are findable. That's where the buck stops, or the euro stops. um, but in terms of the ultimate reality is flipped around from the atomist school, because you find the ultimate reality in that coming together of the parts and the causes to perform a function, like specifically that idea of performing a function. I really like this. I think it's a very useful way to think about reality, is seeing how things come together to perform a function. And of course, this takes like a slightly, a stronger view than the final prasanka madhyamaka, that's ultimate reality, is the coming together of parts to perform a function. And I think, when you see, the idea of performing a function is wrapped up with the mind, because the functions don't exist outside. Like, the function is labeled by us, like of, making dinner or something like that, or even the sun shining or something like that. It's a particular way of like looking at reality and labeling a part of it. So I think when you really look at the function doesn't exist without the participation of the mind in this school. Like a function is the function is a label. Right? It's not a pure like direct experience, right? Or a primary mind, or whatever they'd call it, I guess. Like the function is actually an elaborated concept that comes from our mind. But it's interdependent. Obviously, it's not only in the mind. Function isn't only in the mind. It's a dependence between, like, what you observe, the interaction of, parts, how they come together, the cause that brings them together, and then your mind that then asserts, that's making dinner, or teaching a class. So, but they would see a different. Like, obviously, if there was a deer in my room here, the deer wouldn't perceive me teaching a class, right? So it's subjective. Like, the idea of a function is highly subjective. Does that make sense?
Okay, very clear. Thank you. Yeah.
Short answer, yes, I think, from the school, right? It's hard to use the normal. Somehow it's a lot of work to distill the school down to the simpler, plainer language way of understanding it. Maybe it made more sense in Tibetan and Sanskrit. Any other questions or comments?
And what about things that we perceive as useless or crazy, stupid? It's like there are things that does not fit or something like that. We want to shout at somebody because somebody invented something that does not make sense.
I mean, that's still nonsense as a function, right? I mean, it's quite there's nothing about functions that says, people have to agree that they make sense or not sense, right? So it's your label, though. Your subjective label is nonsense, that another person will make a lot of sense to them. So I think any function, I mean, yeah, you do get into these debates about like valid and invalid and so on. Like, if someone's actually hallucinating and so on, like, those become kind of deeper questions. But still, they're perceiving something performing a function from their perspective. So I think it's quite broad, right? It's anything that your mind labels upon parts and the causes that bring them together. But with one person says it's nonsense and the other doesn't, I think that's, in general, that's subjective, unless you have like psychosis or something like that. Although again, it's very very hard to say, which reality is more like accurate than the other in these levels, right? Because we hear the amazing stories of like the 3 levels of reality that like of more lower beings and ordinary beings and highly evolved beings would see reality completely different. This story is about a sangha and so on. To get into like deep Buddhism, right? This story is about a sangha doing a 12-year retreat, trying to meet Maitreya and get teachings from him. And then it turns out, Maitreya was there every day showing up, but the sangha just couldn't see him. So from the Buddhist perspective, there's aspects of reality that we can't see and that others can, or we become able to see at later times. But even from a very like secular perspective, that's true. Like if you know about physics, or if you know about supply chains, you see reality different than a person who doesn't. Like a person who doesn't, or I think about meat a lot for children. Like I'm mostly vegetarian, but like to a child, when they eat meat, I'm like, delicious. What's this yummy thing? Like you have to teach them. Like my daughter, you have to, like, and my daughter gradually, like, because she takes care of chickens, and then like is eating chicken, and she's like, oh, I wonder, because they had to get rid of one of their chickens after school, and she's like, oh, I wonder if this is, so the name of the chicken, right? So even in ordinary life, like if you don't, no one ever tells you where meat comes from. Like with kids for a long time, it's just yum yum, delicious. Then eventually you're like, ooh, wait, I understand cause and effect. Like I chopped off its head and ripped off its feathers, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's it's very subjective and individual how we see reality, and there's kind of more supernatural ways we hear about in Buddhism that are very hard to, I think, perceive and understand for us. But even ordinary ones, like I like this example of meat a lot, actually, because I think we've all seen it if we have kids, or if we remember our experience as children, remember learning like, oh wait, what is this thing I'm eating on my plate? It's that cute little animal.
Thank you.
Is that okay? Does that help answer your question? Is that in the
I
direction
think
of what
it
you were?
helped. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Nonsense. That's a real anything. Concepts are very, very strong, good objects to meditate on, dependent arising. The dependent arising of concepts is very, very powerful, because you start to see like no concept exists on its own. Like when I heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when I first heard this teaching, he taught on dependent origination, and he started talking about how all the concepts are dependent upon each other, like hot and cold. There's no absolute hot and cold in the universe. Like we have to have those dualities defined against each other to define those terms. There's only a relative hot and cold. There's only something warmer than something that's cooler. We know in physics, hot and cold. This was a really deep question, actually, in science for hundreds, or if not thousands of years, is what is temperature? Like we used to think there was actually a substance called caloric. It was the actual substance that everything had that held its temperature. And then it was what was it, like Boltzmann or something? I don't remember, but somebody figured out eventually that heat is just the movement. It's just how fast molecules are moving. It's an extraordinary revelation, right? What's amazing about Buddhism is that it figured out certain ideas about dependent origination from a purely philosophical perspective without having to understand science, so to just see that without understanding how deep heat and hot and cold are, that just one depends on the other. It's just nothing's intrinsically hot and nothing's intrinsically tall or short. It's only in relation to, there's not a tall person, a short person, they're only in relation to each other. So there's a reason I say this is it might be useful to meditate on nonsense, do like the dependent origination on nonsense and sense, and try to understand those two concepts and how totally intertwined they are. You actually can't have nonsense without sense, and vice versa. And there's not exactly a clear boundary between them, if any, in that continuum. It's a label. But it doesn't mean things aren't more verifiable according to measured reality and so on. But you have to define your nonsense and sense. All right, any other questions? That's a great one. What a great question.
Any other question?
Yeah. I got a lot of questions,
Good.
but please, you go. I already asked a question.
All right, I could start with a referral to the neuroscientist called Dan Siegel. You might know him. I read a few books where he explains what is mind, and he said it's like the understanding of something with the mind, the brain, and all the circuit in the to the nervous system, the gut, and but also in the sensory perception, also how you relate to other people. So he adds this dimension of attunement or synchronicity that and it's very tasty, in fact, because it's like we're not isolated from each other, but it's how the transaction of information. Would that correlate with this school, or is it something out of those schools? And what would be the explanation of like this?
I
That's just
think there are so many different, it's a very, very active area of research. And it's actually neuroscience, consciousness. It used to be taboo to have consciousness research, like what's the mind, what's consciousness. 20 years ago, you were very fringe to even talk about that in science. So now there's whole departments and fields. It's great, but it's very, very, very early. There's a great book called Being You, Emil Sess, about the kind of state of the art in consciousness research. So I haven't heard that particular. I don't know that particular scientist, and that's it sounds very, very rich and but preliminary. There's many competing definitions for mind and consciousness in science, and there used to be none. Like when I was in college, there was none. There was no definition, no scientific definition of consciousness. And now there's some different competing ones, but they're very, very tentative. A very common one is that it's subjective experience. Like the sense that I'm experiencing something subjectively. Now with artificial intelligence too, a lot of people are talking about how those systems could eventually become consciousness, and they're saying similar things that it's quite likely that nothing could be conscious without senses or even without a body. That's one hypothesis, is that you need senses and a body to be conscious. So a pure disembodied AI like we have today with ChatGPT, some people claim could never be conscious because you need a body and you need senses, which probably implies some of the things you're saying, like you need that interrelationality, interactivity with the outside world. So I think that says, I don't know that particular writer, but it sounds like it's going in this direction for sure, saying that because there was this idea of like a brain in a jar, the idea that you could have a brain alive in a jar and then have this rich inner life. And now I think scientists are really questioning whether that's even possible, that you really do have to have interactions. If you read Carlo Rovelli, he talks about this in a more fundamental way of interrelationality, but that from a physics perspective, that's all there is. There's nothing but interaction. Like there's no sender, there's no receiver, there's only messages. That's how, when you look at like physics at its fundamental reality, so I think there's really something there that all there is it's like the illusion of the sender and the receiver. Like all there is the message itself. So I don't know, probably again, I think these things are good just to bring into your meditation. Like you see, I go into some detail, and sometimes people complain about the excruciating detail sometimes with all the atoms and parts, but I do think it really helps, at least for some people, because you can gloss over in your meditation and be like, yeah, everything's made out of parts, but you don't really, it's superficial. Like to really get a sense that things are made of parts, I think it helps to really, really think about in great detail and learn. We know so much about them. That's why I think meditation on emptiness is in some ways so much easier today, because we have so much knowledge of how things really do break down into parts. They didn't have this at the time. It's kind of amazing. They didn't have this at the time these schools were invented. They just had the philosophical idea that things were broken down into atoms. The ancient Greeks had this too, but there wasn't any evidence for it. It was just a philosophical assertion. So I don't know. I really do think the Dalai Lama too. He says he meditates half his emptiness meditation every day is on quantum physics. So I just think there's so much to. That's why I like this approach. I think there's so much to the empirical approach, taking everything we know about from science, really aid these meditations. They're very, very juicy and tasty if you add in everything you learn on science documentaries and books. So yeah, I think what comes from that book is probably very, very useful in this meditation. But I don't know if it's exactly the same. You know, it probably has some relation, but not exactly the same. Or although it could be, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
You probably know better than I do because you read it.
Oh no! Oh no! Other questions? Please raise your hand or just
Yeah.
ask.
Yeah. So, so you said, well, labels can, in ultimate reality, labels exist together with your mind. Phenomena exist as well, parts that exist as a function. I don't know really how to use language with this one, but
Yeah.
it is really clear that. Well, my question is, can phenomena, like other people have different perspectives? So if someone sees a car with like sees their car and what their car can do, play music and stuff, and you don't see it, you you don't even see that car, so you don't even think it exists, the car. So in this school, is it then that you, once you sit and do your own investigation, there are these things outside of your experience that do exist on ultimate reality, or is it really limited to your
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. So in this school, I mean, I don't talk as much in this class. I don't know if I talk at all about this like valid and invalid. But yeah, there are things said to be like valid and invalid, right? That's a good example. So you hear some music playing and it's coming from a car, but in your mind you just think it's coming from like a speaker somewhere or something like that, right? It's just like the two ways of interpreting this sound, right? That's what you're saying. So yeah, one is in this school, it's not saying that like that yours is just as valid as the others. Like it is incorrect. Your perspective is incorrect. Like when you go and look, the sound's coming from a car and not from a little boombox. But that doesn't matter so much. Like we're just saying, like you can add on that layer of whether things are valid or invalid. I always found the valid and invalid actually quite tricky when you start looking at it because I didn't feel like it was very well defined. Like they talk about it as being a kind of consensus, like if other valid minds agree with you with what you're saying, like it seems to be very provisional. But I think that's how things really are. You know, it's how are you going to establish something except through, you know, consensus and debate and so on. So I think there's a natural provisionality built into those ideas of valid and invalid conceptions. But this school isn't saying like anything you think is true. That's postmodern thought, you know, which is actually, and I apologize if anyone like really loves postmodernity, but this is one of the problems with the postmodern philosophy is it does make this assertion that basically anything you think is true, like that any position is valid, and is a very nihilistic view and actually quite a harmful view because it just starts to say basically whatever you think is true. So there are people who take this view, and I personally, this is just like my personal self talking now. I do think that's quite harmful, and it's more and more dominant in our culture. Actually, like more and more this like particular postmodern view that anything a person thinks is valid from their own subjective experience a very harmful idea because it's nihilistic. It just means like it starts to lead towards not believing morality matters, not caring about the planet and so on, things like that. Like it's very difficult. So no, I think there are concepts that are like valid and invalid. Establishing them is really tricky because I think the ultimate validity is realizing emptiness, right? Like that's the only sort of ultimate validity, and that's what this whole class is about: is finding that the ultimate validity is like the most subtle way that things exist. Everything built on top of that is provisional. So when you say the ultimate reality in this school is the coming together of parts, causing conditions, and the mind labeling them, it's not saying everything you label is accurate. Like just because it pops into your head, it's accurate. It's just saying that that is where this sense of ultimate truth lies, in that nexus. I mean, but you're getting at the reasons why you critique the school too, right? Like you're getting at some of the subtle criticisms of the school that lead to the higher schools. Because you're like what you're saying, this came up in the last class. It's very, very natural. If you're doing these meditations effectively, it's very natural that the questions you're saying arise, because you're immediately going, like you're basically going to the mind-only questions of, well, isn't reality all in your mind? Which is a very, very valid. It's a logical. Let's not say valid. It's a logical step to take after doing this meditation, and that's why the next class addresses that perspective, which is actually a little bit more subtle than this perspective, and quite defensible. Like from a Buddhist perspective, it was more defensible, from that next school, the Chittamatra or Yogacara school. But I think actually, even from a scientific perspective, it's a little bit more defensible from a quantum reality perspective. But then if you think just in terms of benefit to your mind, again, the benefit of this school and the last one, it's extraordinary. If you only meditated on emptiness this way your whole life, I think you'd have an extraordinary benefit. If everyone in the world held this philosophical position, I think we'd have a much better world. So I think it's so important to see how powerful all the schools are. The first one is, they say the Theravada school, the animist school, they say is the view of emptiness of at least some Theravada schools, and very highly realized, very kind, beneficial, wise practitioners who have achieved very high realizations, and according to their school, have achieved enlightenment from this perspective. Any other question?
Yeah, hi Scott. I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Mikhail.
Well, it's actually more of a comment maybe. I think I heard you say that, and I get that you might come from a different philosophical standpoint than I do. That's fine. When I studied tennis with the Dorje Damdul, he was, when you talk about cognition in the different schools, there is this concept of yogic direct perception. And I heard you say that the knowledge we have of atoms, etc., today, they did not have 2,500 years ago. And I might actually dispute that. If I was to speak in the way I have understood the tradition, I find it very interesting that both Greek philosophers and Hindu and Buddhist yogis have actually described nature in a way that's very, very accurate in terms of what we have come up with through a fairly new science today. And I'm a big fan of science usually, but I would just maybe question that assertion a little bit and saying, what happens when we do actually realize emptiness, when we do sort of cleanse the doors of perception and have all these when we have all the conceptuality and the wrong notions of existence that we usually apply to existence, when they sort of fall away from our perception, what occurs then? And I think the tradition would say, well, at the end, when you realize emptiness, you have yogic direct perception and you see things the way they are. That way.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right that yes, for the highly realized beings who have that yogic direct perception, they did see reality into all the scientific truth that we know and beyond. Absolutely. What I was trying to say there, and I probably did a bad job, is that what we have today is this, science is new. Science and it's extraordinary. The scientific method is very new. There's a couple examples of it. There's an example in the Bible, actually, of a scientific method. It was the first written account of a scientific methodical test. But what I was trying to say is that for a person without yogic direct perception, we have the extraordinary luxury of external validation of these subtle aspects of reality that can aid our meditation. At this, instead of having to believe somebody or trust a teacher or something like that. We actually have so much validity through external instruments and the scientific method and so on that enhance our ability to, I think, our faith. Faith is actually an important mental factor. And having so much scientific evidence for the subtle aspects of reality, I think really enhances people, at our level, of having faith in these different perspectives, because we have, external scientifically arrived at conclusions that are coherent with these philosophical perspectives. So totally agree with you. Yogic direct perceivers would see reality and all this truth and way beyond it. So I hope that makes it more clear. That I was just trying to say, for an ordinary person, it's the kind of luxury we have as modern people to have so much external evidence to help us meditate. In particular, what I was trying to say is more practical, that there's so much detail that we have to be able to meditate on. Just knowing that all the heavy elements of our hand, the elements in our hands came from stars that exploded before our stars were born. You can touch yourself with them. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. That kind of extraordinary, totally not debatable, absolutely provable to the deepest level of our scientific knowledge. Most people couldn't meditate like that even 200 years ago. You have to take it on the faith of your teacher, and now we have this more empirical proof. So some things have degenerated over time, but this is one way I think that the scientific worldview enhances our ability to meditate on emptiness. So thank you for asking that, or saying that. That's very, very, very helpful and accurate.
Scott, my question has to do with the fact that I thought that the self that we were looking for in all these four different schools was a independent, unitary, and permanent self. And here you say that this functionist school, ends up with the conclusion that the self is a stream of conscious moments of awareness that is constantly changing. So it seems to be a contradiction with the postulate of what the self should be. So how do you reconcile these two facts?
Right. So it's in the first three schools that the self that we're refuting is the permanent partless. It's even the first 3.5 or whatever, but the permanent partless independent self is the self that we're refuting. Definitely. Yeah, you're right. But when you refute it, where you then find yourself, you get a different answer in the first three schools. Right. So in all the schools, the one you're refuting, it's you try to find a self that that it has always exists. You try a self that never changes, and a self that's solid, not made out of parts. And each of them refutes that. But then what it finds on the other end is different for the first three schools, right? Because the first school finds the self in the atoms.
Yeah.
The second school we did today, it finds itself in it's a little bit, right? There's two things, right? Because it finds ultimate reality. This phenomena, it finds what we're talking about the self. We'll only talk about the self. It finds the self in consciousness, in indivisible conscious moments. The next school will find the self in the mind in a slightly more subtle way. And then the last one is the one that is the most subtle in the Prasangika Madhyam. And that even has a different self that it's refuting. So the permanent, partless, independent are really refuted for the first three schools. And then there's another subtler aspect of self that's also refuted in the Prasangika Madhyamaka. Does that make sense? So I think it's consistent with your understanding.
It does make sense. So does that mean that the functionalist school refutes the permanent, unitary, and independent self, but does it mean that it also refutes the self of the atomist school, and that the next school will refute also the self of the functionalist school?
Yeah. It's they each find the self in a different. The first one finds the self in the atom, actually finds itself in its physical components, it's atoms. The second one finds itself in awareness, and then we'll see it. We'll see next time, next class, where we find the self in the Yogacara or mind only. I sort of meld them together, because they're actually slightly different, the mind only and Yogacara. The Yogacara starts to move towards the middle way philosophy, but we kind of look at them together in this class. So I think that one becomes much more subtle, because there's a kind of mind, there's like a mindness that's more subtle than just awareness. Anyway, I don't think you can that's why we spend so much time in meditation in the class, because I think it's hard to just summarize. It's easier to talk about in words after you did the meditation, because we refer to the experience we all had together. So I think we'll do that next time. But thanks for asking that. I think it's Scott, I really like teaching this class and taking it with you guys. It helps me, because over time it fades. It fades. I was even telling one of my teachers about this. I'm like, yeah, at some point I do that. It's really nice to study it again and remember and see that it is, you can have some experience in meditation and feel like you understand the perspectives. Not that we've realized it, but understand how to meditate on it. Any other questions? I'm glad we had time for so many questions. Nice.
I have a question. I could think of, I have a question that's regarded to this school. But I'm actually more interested in asking than a question about the mind-only school, or something which is related about what I was asking before. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. If it goes too much, first of all, we only have a couple minutes, and second of all, I don't want to go too much detail into mind only. But if it's about the relation to this functionalist school, I think it's okay.
Yeah. Well. Okay. So it's about this school. Yeah. So I was thinking about if it's either invalid or valid, these functions. Well, do both both do not ultimately exist, right? Only the valid ones, the valid functions exist ultimately, right? Because if that's so, then you actually need other people to say, yeah, this is ultimate reality.
I think that's a hard question. There's different levels of reality. Like there's a level of reality, like once you realize emptiness, like that's the only valid, truly valid is this, like Mikkel is saying, the yogic director. So someone who's realized emptiness is the only one who sees reality validly and ultimately. And these meditations are, the experience isn't the words, right? Like it's very, very important to remember that the experience isn't the words, and all these words we use are just get us to an experience that transcends the words. So I think we try to just use the specific definitions, like in this particular school, where ultimate reality is the coming together of the mind labeling parts that are findable in their tiniest elements that come together through causes and conditions. But whether one of those is but you'd have to realize that, like, it's not saying just thinking about that is ultimate reality, right? We have to actually have that realization. So what we're describing is just a process. Like we've described a process to try to realize ultimate reality, but none of us, I hope some of us have actually, but probably none of us had that, did actually perceive ultimate reality in our meditation, but it's a continuum, we come closer to it. So I think I think it's very, very subtle as you study emptiness over the years. Like and I'm nowhere near realizing it. I think your mind does like get to slightly subtler understanding of it, and like that's a subtle point, is that the emptiness isn't just thinking about that combination of three things and boom, that's ultimate reality. It's saying that's the process. Like that's the process you go through to see ultimate reality, is to examine things in that way until you break through to understanding that in the deepest, most fundamental way. So maybe that I think that's the nicest takeaway, just to remember, like it's not just thinking about things in this way that's emptiness. It's actually, it's realizing it. So we just described a process. We've had a taste of that. We've probably had a little taste of that experience. We haven't actually realized emptiness. So I think that's the best way to think about it, is more like this. It's the process and the path that it's describing. It's not that if you just get the concepts right that you understand emptiness, because emptiness is non-conceptual. It's just a very skillful way to eventually lead you there.
Yeah, so you need, if you want to go more subtle, maybe you need like the third school and then the fourth school to actually realize emptiness? Or do you think it's also possible just via the methods of this school to fully realize emptiness?
So again, that is the answer to that is deep, because it's all from a specific perspective. Like from a Theravada perspective, certain Theravada perspective, the meditation of emptiness from the first class, you realize emptiness. You can realize emptiness that way, and you can become an arhat. And from their school, that arhat is enlightened. From our school, we actually say they still have like subtle misunderstandings. Even if you have like the total realization of this school, you still haven't completely understood the nature of reality. So it's dependent. That's when they say, that's one of the kind of coolest lessons of emptiness is emptiness itself is empty. Like and we realize that it's one of the reasons I think you study these schools, is to realize the relationality of emptiness itself and how different practitioners have different perspectives. Personally, I've become much more humble about that idea, it just seems very sectarian to say like only Prasangika can achieve enlightenment, even though I know like intellectually and according to our school, like, and that's the case. Still, I'm not totally sure I believe that. Like, I think maybe, the Theravada practitioners who said they did enlightenment, maybe they really did. I don't know how any of us could know for sure. But the very, very wise, realized teachers in our lineage have said they did it, so that's the place where we have some insight. I think it's good to just keep those things as questions in some ways rather than have firm conclusions, because what I've found is if you're not sure, it means you're constantly thinking about emptiness because you're constantly asking, like, because I've been corrected recently. I was writing about this. I was corrected by some very good teachers, and what I found is like the corrections made me think so much, like thinking about emptiness so much more often when I'm not sure than when I am sure. So maybe that's a nice place to end the discussion. I'll see you next time. I'm really enjoying this class so much with all of you, and thank you so much for joining. It's really a great way to spend time together.